Throughout history, terrorism has claimed millions of innocent lives, disrupting societies around the world. As the 21st century began, dramatic terrorist strikes raised global tensions, provoking intense fears of future attacks. But what exactly is terrorism? Despite disagreements over what incidents can truly be called terrorism, most agree that terrorism is the calculated use or threat of violence to achieve a specific goal. Most experts agree that terrorist acts are not random, but rather each is done with a specific purpose, usually to make a political point or to force the terrorist's belief on the rest of society. While each act of terror is a unique event, terrorism generally can be divided into two categories. Terrorism from above, in which governments lash out against their own people, and terrorism from below, in which groups or individuals try to disrupt the civil order to further their own agendas. Because of the monopoly of force held by the state, terrorism from above, terror launched by a state against its own citizens, has caused many more deaths throughout history than acts of terrorism by groups and individuals. Terrorism from above often begins with a ruthless leader who offers his followers political or philosophical justifications for what is nothing more than mass murder. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler pursued his vision of German racial domination by methodically killing over 11 million people, including 6 million Jews, both in Germany and neighboring countries. Other dictators have used the argument of class to justify murder. In 1949, China's Mao Zedong led a successful peasant revolution under the banner of the Communist Party. Millions died from starvation when the communists forcibly attempted to industrialize the country, and throughout the following decades, government forces hunted down anyone remotely linked to China's pre-communist past, the West, or the educated classes, including monks, teachers, and members of the former upper class. Altogether, Mao's government is estimated to have caused a staggering 30 million or more deaths. In Cambodia, the communist leader Pol Pot led a guerrilla rebellion to overthrow the government in 1975. Over the next 4 years, in the name of social and agricultural reform, his Khmer Rouge party attacked the country's educated and urban classes, killing at least 1.5 million people through forced labor, starvation, disease, torture, and mass execution. Much of the country's culture, as well as up to a third of its population, was annihilated. Despite worldwide outrage over such atrocities, terrorism from above continued to be practiced late in the 20th century by leaders such as Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic. Following the breakup of Yugoslavia, during which clashing ethnic groups often resorted to terror, Milosevic argued that Serbs should dominate the region. He supported attempts to wipe out the region's non-Serb majority in a gruesome process known as ethnic cleansing. Fear of this ethnic violence in the former Yugoslavia created almost 1 million political refugees. The international community has frequently been reluctant to step in to stop the bloodshed when nations have terrorized their own peoples, as was the case in China and Cambodia. One lesson of the 20th century is that the international community must remain vigilant to state terrorism and acts of genocide, as well as terrorism committed by individuals and groups. In the face of real or perceived oppression, some individuals and groups have turned to terror themselves to fight back. This type of terrorism, terrorism from below, has been described as a weapon of the weak, since it has allowed apparently powerless groups a quick, cheap, and effective way to pursue their own goals against the full might of a country's government. For example, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress in South Africa, the ANC, turned to violence and sometimes terrorism to fight against apartheid, the government's policy that legally oppressed the black majority for years. After a decades-long fight, apartheid finally ended in 1994, and the ANC won democratic elections to rule the nation.
The leader of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, was labeled by the South African apartheid government as a criminal and a terrorist. But many years later, Nelson Mandela stuck to his commitment to the rule of law and turned into a statesman, where he successfully led South Africa into the democratic era and gained legitimacy throughout the world as South Africa's democratically elected leader.
However, after the elections, government commissions found that thousands of civilians had been tortured and killed along the way, both by the ANC and by apartheid government agents. What began as a political fight had led to a tragic era of torture and murder on both sides. Sometimes, terrorism from below succeeds in disrupting a government without offering an alternative to the government in power. The result is anarchy and fear. In Colombia, for almost half a century, a guerrilla army of mostly poor, rural workers has resorted to terrorism to fight a series of Colombian governments. The guerrillas generated so much fear and caused so much damage to the national economy that it has been difficult for anyone to restore order. In the resulting anarchy, powerful drug cartels seized many national resources, contributing to the climate of terror for their own enrichment. Why do governments use terrorism? In general, state terrorism occurs so frequently because it often succeeds. The regime in power might resort to terror to prevent other parties or popular movements from taking control. For almost 30 years, Joseph Stalin, dictator of the old Soviet Union, tortured, killed, or exiled millions of potential enemies, real and imagined, including many army officers and thousands of fellow members of the Communist Party. On the island nation of Haiti, beginning in 1958, dictator François Papadoc Duvalier maintained an iron grip on power by torturing and murdering hundreds of political opponents through the dreaded security police known as the Tonton Macoute. The quest to gain and hold power can motivate terrorism from below, too. Groups trying to establish a homeland based on shared religion, ethnicity, or language frequently resort to terrorism to fight existing governments. Since the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, competing groups have fought for control of Kashmir, a predominantly Muslim region divided between Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India. Since 1990, the fighting has claimed thousands of lives. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, groups fighting for their own ethnic or religious regions have escalated. The most vicious fighting has occurred in Chechnya, a predominantly Muslim region seeking independence from Russia. Individuals turn to terrorism for a variety of reasons. Timothy McVeigh bombed the Murrah building in Oklahoma City as a way to lash back at what he felt was a too intrusive and powerful federal government. Theodore Kaczynski, the so-called Unabomber, sent mail bombs in an attempt to publicize his manifesto against the advance of technology. While it may seem a paradox that many terrorists kill in the name of religion, for thousands of years, religion has served as a motivation for terrorism. The catastrophic suicide missions against the United States on September 11, 2001, in which thousands of innocent people died, were motivated in part by an extreme interpretation of the Islamic faith. While Islam is a religion of peace to millions of Muslims, others of that faith have associated piety with violence and even martyrdom, killing themselves and civilians in the name of Allah.
Extremists such as Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have perverted the law of Islam to suit their own political ends. It's important to note, however, that the majority of Muslims do not share Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's radical interpretation of the Quran. And it's also important to note that extremists from other religions have also engaged in terror acts in order to fulfill their own political and ideological goals.
In 1994, a Jewish extremist named Baruch Goldstein walked into a mosque in Hebron, a site holy to both Muslims and Jews in the contested West Bank, and sprayed Muslim worshippers with machine gun fire. 29 died before the survivors subdued and killed Goldstein. Terrorists have devised a range of strategies to accomplish their goals. Because they often seek to generate fear, terrorists generally pick targets that will maximize that fear. Public places where crowds can usually be found. Since terrorists can rarely match the force of the governments they target, they hope that each person who is killed will terrify thousands more. As part of their strategy to achieve their goals and objectives, terrorists often strike to obtain maximum media exposure. Terrorists rely on media coverage of their crimes, bombings, hijackings, and assassinations to get their messages out. One authority said that terrorism is aimed at the people watching rather than at the victims.
In a globalized world where you've got the capacity to watch what's happening around the world, it takes something really dramatic to get the world's attention. Killing innocent people in large numbers, unfortunately, is one way to do that.
In the 20th century, terrorists often selected specific targets. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, for instance, was assassinated by a group of Egyptian fundamentalists who opposed the historic peace treaty he signed with Israel in 1979. In India, both Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her son and successor, Rajiv Gandhi, were killed by political dissidents. In Israel, a religious Jewish teenager named Yigal Amir assassinated moderate Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 to protest the Middle East peace process. In recent years, however, terrorists have been more willing to kill indiscriminately, apparently striking to create mass terror, and in turn, pressure governments to give in to their demands. In 1997, fundamentalist Egyptian militants ambushed tourists visiting an ancient temple at Luxor, shooting dozens of foreign visitors. On September 11, 2001, suicide attacks attributed to Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda organization killed thousands. The message seemed to be that no one is safe. Over the years, terrorists have found a number of ways to strike, all apparently designed to generate both panic and publicity. The 1970s and 80s saw a wave of airplane hijackings. In June of 1985, a militant Muslim group hijacked TWA Flight 847 on its way from Athens to Rome, capturing over 150 mostly American hostages and killing a U.S. Navy diver on board. The group held many of the hostages for over 2 weeks, demanding the release of prisoners from Israel, In a complicated deal, Israel released many Muslim prisoners so that the terrorists would free the remaining hostages. Many terrorists have struck with bombs, which can be crude or sophisticated, detonated from a distance, or on the body of the attacker, a favorite strategy of Palestinian suicide bombers in Israel. The Irish Republican Army often turned to bombing in its terrorist campaign to end British rule in Northern Ireland. They transformed one Belfast summer day in 1972 into a scene of horror by detonating a bomb in a crowd of afternoon shoppers, and as people ran for safety, another bomb and then another, every 5 to 8 minutes for the next hour and a half, 22 in all. Bloody Friday killed 9 people and injured over 100, becoming a grim milestone in the history of terrorism. Other terrorists have turned to kidnapping, sometimes as a way to get ransom money to help finance their terrorist operations. In Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and other countries in Latin America, hundreds of business executives and public figures disappear each year, abducted at gunpoint and held for ransom. Kidnapping has become so common in these countries that while it terrifies many, few cases even make the evening news. Throughout history, terrorists have relied on simple weapons for obvious reasons. They are cheap, easy to obtain, and hard to detect. Yet today, authorities have found themselves particularly concerned about terrorists' ability to obtain weapons of mass destruction, whether chemical, biological, or even nuclear. For example, the Aum Shinrikyo movement in Japan obtained chemical weapons for an assault in the Japanese subways in 1995. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there have been fears that small nuclear weapons could fall into the hands of terrorists because of shoddy accounting methods in Russia over its nuclear stockpile, or that Russian nuclear scientists, desperate to make money, might be willing to sell their skills to the highest bidders. What kind of person becomes a terrorist? Experts warn against stereotypes, since history shows that terrorists come from all backgrounds, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, working class and royalty.
Because terrorists are motivated by political ideology and their belief that they're right and the system is wrong, it's virtually impossible for us to identify a terrorist based on our preconceived notions of what a terrorist might look like, because they can come in any shape, size, or color.
Nevertheless, many terrorists share broad characteristics. Above all, terrorists tend to be young, filled with passionate beliefs, and often a sense of immortality. Some terrorists can be considered followers. They might see themselves as victims acting out the role of hero for their group. They may also oversimplify reality, seeing the world in terms of black and white, good and evil. Many followers believe in revenge and, dangerously, are often willing to die for their cause. Sometimes their motives are not strictly selfless. Followers may hope for reward in the afterlife, while in this life their families may receive cash payments from sympathetic groups or governments as an expression of appreciation for the son or daughter's life. Many terrorist leaders also share characteristics. They are often charismatic and fanatical, using their skill with language to recruit others to their cause and persuading them to fight for it. Terrorist leaders also often have the education and wealth to support their destructive visions, providing the money and the technical training to accomplish it. For example, take Osama bin Laden, a multi-millionaire from Saudi Arabia, who supported a religious decree or fatwa against the U.S. in 1996. bin Laden claimed that the mere presence of Americans in Saudi Arabia had desecrated Muslim holy sites during and after the Persian Gulf War. He also charged the United States with supporting what he believed to be corrupt and oppressive governments in the Arab world. He used his wealth and influence to build a global terror network. Al-Qaeda, focused on removing U.S. troops from the region, unifying Islamic people under one state, and obliterating the State of Israel. Exiled from Saudi Arabia for his calls to violence, bin Laden moved first to the Sudan and then to Afghanistan. Among the attacks linked to bin Laden, an attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the devastating suicide airplane raids on New York's World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001. Bin Laden and other terrorist leaders have been known to run terrorist training camps where would-be warriors learn to fire guns, build and plant bombs, and infiltrate foreign cultures, all in the name of religious devotion. Terrorist leaders have paid for thousands to receive such training and to return to America, Europe, and Asia bent on destruction. Do terrorists ever achieve their goals? In some cases, terrorism from below has played a role in toppling colonial rulers in nations including Algeria, Vietnam, and South Africa. Terrorism from above has enabled dictators from Hitler and Stalin to Duvalier and Milosevic to maintain power for years. Terrorism has been less successful within and against democratic governments, although some experts warn that terrorists may provoke such governments into overreacting and betraying their own democratic ideals. The U.S., while shaken by bin Laden's repeated attacks, remained steadfast. Indeed, terrorist attacks can strengthen a nation's resolve to persevere. Terrorists have enjoyed more success in radically changing their own country's religious or political order. Muslim fundamentalists, for instance, installed a strict religious government in Afghanistan that ruled for 5 years amid a climate of repression and fear. But when terrorism spills over national borders, as is increasingly the case in the 21st century, its chances of achieving anything other than spreading death and fear are greatly reduced. Nevertheless, terrorism remains a feature of the modern world, horrifying, unpredictable, and often incomprehensible. All lives are touched by the threat of terrorism, and too many nations and families bear its scars.